I would like to welcome you to Standard Theory. This is an introduction to the standard theory of psychology. This is a theory that aims to explain everything about human behavior. The theory describes something called the Standard Behavioral Index along with several other things. The Standard Behavioral Index is comprised of two main parts. One is the scale of impulse or the Z scale. The second is the scale of intelligence, or the R scale. In the following segments we will discuss some of the main ideas that the theory is based on. From there, we will talk about things that are much more specific. Among these are categories referred to as thinking types and communication types, which are important to the structures of each of the scales. We will begin by using a unilateral view, meaning that, for now, we will only discuss the things that happen when things go the way they are supposed to in a constructive sense. We will explore the scales from lowest energy to highest energy so that the structure and different aspects of the scales can be presented. In later segments, after the scales have been presented, we can use those scales to answer virtually every question about human behavior. When we look at them from different angles, we can answer questions that are not unilateral. We can answer questions that are abnormal or non-standard phenomenon related to human behavior. Before that, though, we will discuss a few of the ideas that standard theory uses to organize the phenomenon of observing human behavior. Then we can discuss the scales and the thinking types and the communication types of each. Here are the main ideas that provide the foundation for the standard theory of psychology. Number 1. The standard theory of psychology states that the behavior and the communication of humans are related. Behavior and communication influence one another. This happens in order to complete a process known as a cycle of communication. The idea of a cycle of communication refers to the requirement that a process has a discernible beginning and end with something in between. Theoretically, the amount of information processed in communication and behavior can work together in order to achieve a complete cycle of communication. With humans, a complete cycle of communication can be achieved through communication alone. This can also be achieved with behavior alone. Or, as the first idea states, communication and behavior can be used together in order to process any part of either the beginning, middle or end of a cycle in order to create a completed amount of communication. Number 2. The standard theory of psychology states that each complete cycle of communication uses a specific amount of information. That means that there is a required amount of stuff that has to be communicated in order for the brain and its related structures to understand that a cycle of communication has been completed. One complete cycle theoretically handles an amount of information that is favorable to the structures of the brain in a way that allows the information to be handled according to the physical properties of those structures and the networks used in the handling of such information. This is a specific, interval ratio unit of information. When using the R scale, this interval ratio unit can be referred to as a characteristic of communication or simply as a characteristic. The characteristic is the interval ratio unit of the R scale. On the Z scale, though, this interval ratio unit is referred to as a subtraction. On the Z scale, the unit of communication is a subtraction. Number 3. The standard theory of psychology states that these cycles of communication can be observed as constructive or destructive. The communication that people are capable of can tend towards certain directions. For example, the communication or behavior that a person displays can tend towards a greater understanding or greater transmission of information. This is considered constructive communication. Another tendency is to tend towards a smaller amount of information being shared or communicated. That type of communication can be considered to be destructive. There are more complicated combinations of these tendencies, but, for the most part, the overall result of the communication and/or behavior can be considered either constructive or destructive. Number 4. Standard theory states that the goal of all behavior and communication is to experience psychological or neurological activation in a way that can be communicated with others. Theoretically, the only reason that humans communicate or behave in regard to one another is to display some level of neurological or psychological activity. The achievement of that activation would be the fundamental process being communicated and, inversely, that activation would be the process that would lead to some sort of observed behavior. Number 5. The standard theory of psychology states that the disruption of these processes will lead to some amount of compensation. When communication is disrupted, behavior will be used to complete the cycle of communication. When behavior is disrupted, communication will be used to complete the cycle of behavior. Furthermore, any time that either communication or behavior is interrupted, there is a chance that the cycle of communication can be left incomplete. When a person does not have the means to complete these disrupted communication cycles, a process referred to as derangement can occur. Repeated cycles of disruption or derangement can lead to a preference or habit of experiencing communication that is associated with an irregular amount of information. The repeated attempt to fix, reference or deal with a disruption or derangement can possibly lead to an unresolved cycle of communication. This is referred to as cyclic thinking and can be considered the fundamental process which contributes to mental illness. Number 6. The standard theory of psychology identifies a limit on psychological processing. In intelligence, the limit of this process is a person's individual intimate orientation or their own personal understanding of the world around them, as well as the meaning associated with their unique experiences of the world. This limit is required to be a person's one-on-one understanding of the world without respect to the environment, new situations or relationships, or outside influence. This requires a maximum amount of psychological activation and is the limit of intelligence. To review, there have been 6 ideas of standard theory presented here. Number 1. Behavior and communication work together to complete a communication cycle. Number 2. There is a specific amount of information in each communication cycle referred to as a characteristic or a subtraction. Number 3. Communication and behavior can be either constructive or destructive. Number 4. The goal of all behavior and communication is to transmit the amount of psychological activation being experienced. Number 5. A cycle of communication can be disrupted and, if not fixed, can lead to problems such as mental illness. Number 6. There is a limit to the communication that people can experience. In intelligence, this limit is referred to as an intimate orientation. Those main ideas contribute to the dynamics of the Standard Behavioral Index as well as the theory associated with it. Once we have those, we can begin learning about the different parts of the index and 2 of the main scales. The 2 main scales used to describe human behavior are the R scale and the Z scale. Within each of the scales there are categories known as thinking types. Within each thinking type is a communication type. Within that are the specific characteristics and subtractions that people use. These individual units of characteristics and subtractions are organized based on the amount of information that is associated with each level of activation. Each communication type contains a few units of communication. Each thinking type contains a few communication types. The Standard Behavioral Index separates most communication and behavior into one of the 2 scales. From there, the amount of information in that cycle of communication is organized by thinking type. From there, the process is sorted based on the communication type. Finally, a specific characteristic or subtraction can be identified. This process of narrowing down the possibilities of a person's processing allows us to definitively and objectively relate the communication cycle to a specific level of psychological activation. With that, we can attribute their behavior to a specific amount of activation or, namely, to a specific characteristic of communication. Next we will discuss the scales beginning with the Z scale and a simplified version of vertical thinking. Once we understand that, we can move on to intelligent human behavior. Intelligent human behavior has some very specific requirements. We will not discuss those for now. Instead, we will focus on the simplified version of vertical thinking on the Z scale and then move on to each step of the scale of intelligence. Please join me in the next segment to discuss vertical thinking and subtractions.